Hey folks, thanks for joining us today on Real Talk. I'm Aaron Stolze.
And I'm Audrey Schroeder. And with us today we have a special guest, Lindenwood University Professor Brandon McKinney and monster movie enthusiast.
That is official title, Audrey. Please make sure you get that right.
I will keep it straight. You have
personally
a plaque.
registered with the Monster Association of America, and I don't want to offend if such an organization exists, because I'm totally making that up. But if there was, I'd like to be a member.
Well,
so
if
somebody start it and I'll join.
There's not. Yeah, found it. I mean, by all means.
If there's anyone who's qualified, it's you. It's you. And it's appropriate that Brandon's here because today we're talking about Godzilla. I don't know if you've seen the new trailer, but there's a new movie coming out. Reboot, sequel, we don't know which, but it looks like it's going to be on an epic scale.
Could be a little bit of both. I mean, judging by some of the little teasers we see in the trailer that's out there right now, it's hinted at because they reference 1954. So it's a hint that it's referencing or a sort of pseudo-sequel to the 1954 classic, the Japanese version of Gojira, or the original Godzilla, not counting the cobbled together American version with Raymond Burr, Godzilla King of the Monsters, which gave Godzilla his crown. But we should reference this one coming out now. It is an American film. Okay, so it's not made by Toho Studios. And Toho is sort of the premier Japanese film company that produced all the Godzilla movies in the entire series and all the other kaiju, daikaiju films. So this is an American pseudo-sequel.
So it's kind of unheard of that you would have that happening. And it makes you think that the film's probably going to be good. The trailer's teasing at a lot of different things. It's got an all-star cast. You got Bryan Cranston in there. And it's going to be a lot of things. But before we get too far into that, why don't we go ahead and show you the trailer?
I want to talk to somebody in charge. You are not fooling anybody when you say that what happened was a natural disaster. You're lying. It was not an earthquake. It wasn't a typhoon. Because what's really happening is that you're hiding something out there. And it is going to send us back to the Stone Age. God help us all.
In 1954, we awakened something.
Well, there's nuclear tests in the Pacific. Not tests.
They were trying to kill it.
You have no idea what's coming.
Can you kill it?
The arrogance of man is thinking nature is in our control. And not the other way around.
So that trailer still just, it gets me really excited for the movie. It looks exciting. It's going to be a good movie, I think.
He's back to stomp on cities, and whether it's, we don't know if it's in the shores of Japan and Tokyo, or is it, I think of the trailer that I saw in the version, there was the Statue of Liberty sort of destroyed.
New York is what they're trying
New
to
York
tease.
was the setting I think they really teased in the trailer there, but my big question is this just going to be New York? I mean, are we going to see it kind of go global here? I mean, for example, the original 1954, and I keep referencing there, it took place in Tokyo. You know, famous big monster guy in a suit crushing all over Tokyo. And now I see this, and as you were saying, American film adaptation. But I want to know, is this going to be on a global scale? Is it just New York? Is this, going to be Tokyo we can revisit? I want to see where it goes.
I'm hoping for the Godzilla World Tour, sort of Godzilla coast to coast summer tour sort of thing, and he'll be leaving smoking craters in his wake as he moves along, breathing his atomic radiation breath.
Right, and they made him huge, massive this time, just in comparison to the old ones. Because, I mean, the old 1954 Gojira, he comes out of the sea, he's as tall as the buildings, and he tears them down, and it's great. But this Godzilla, it's like, you get a glimpse of his back, and he's massive, and the stormtroopers coming out of the airplanes at him, it's just on a huge scale. And I can't
like those guys are going to
emphasize
take
that
him down.
enough. Right, just this tiny little group of paratroopers.
A nuclear bomb created him, and 4 paratroopers were going to stop him.
Right.
So stay tuned, we'll see.
It'll be interesting to see if they keep the radiation theme. I can't imagine that they would go off that topic because I don't really think it's been deviated from in the entire existence of Godzilla.
Godzilla's role has changed as a monster, but primarily it started as a force of nature in the 1954 film. Of course, he's released and created by a nuclear explosion. And now you could argue it's Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or it was a nuclear test. But essentially, there's this prehistoric lizard that's a gross combination between a Stegosaurus and a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Okay, well, literally, it's sort of an aquatic gorilla, because literally translated, the Gojira was a rough cobbled together translation of both, or combination of gorilla and Kujira, or whale. So he's literally a gorilla whale rendered radioactive by a nuclear blast. So his role, at least in the first film, and if we're talking about the series, and we're going to go down that road here, basically was a force of nature. Then in the follow-up, Godzilla Raids Again, he's portrayed more as a villain. He's coming back, although he's a force of nature, now he's a villain, he wants revenge for supposedly being destroyed in the first film by the scientist with the eye patch.
Yes.
Yeah. I still gets me every time when I think about the cast, like the people who deal with Godzilla, for example. Well, what I'm really getting at is the 55 American cut of the original Gojira.
Same cut, re-edited, and with additional footage with TV's Perry Mason, Raymond Burr, sort of explaining it away. And it's not surprising they kind of cut out more of the more critical aspects of the film, discussing man's technology and nuclear testing, because that could have been interpreted critical on the American audience.
It
or
was a
American
very
government at the time.
politically driven film at the time, and I mean, just little details. The sound of Godzilla, Godzilla's footsteps is atomic blasts, and so
Bombs dropping.
all kinds of things happening that just as aftermath of world wars, and so the recut was very limited, I think, in its explanations.
And it was quite, the original film, although the American re-edited version of it is kind of seen as sort of a cheesy monster movie. But however, at the time in Japan, the original cut of Gojira was frightening. You have to look at it in the time frame. This is post-war Reconstruction Japan, all right, after it was decimated after World War II. We're seeing a golden age then of Japanese film, Nihon Iga, after the deoccupation with the Supreme Allied Commanders. MacArthur's out of there. Censorship on what Japan, at least the film industry, could do at that time has been lifted. So we're seeing this sort of blossoming of films. But this use of Godzilla, sort of a walking nuclear bomb hitting multiple cities, just starting in Tokyo, had to be tremendously frightening for the citizens of Japan and the public at that time that saw that film.
Now, we can't talk about Godzilla without talking about the 1998 disaster.
Cringe.
I can't speak to it. I have to tell you, I've seen parts of it, but I can't sit and watch that film all the way through.
You got Matthew Broderick in it, and there's not a lot of things that you can say about it because there wasn't a lot good to say about it.
And it should be noted, they've almost Godzilla fans have sort of distanced themselves from this film, and that the film itself is only Godzilla in name only on the film, because now they refer to the monster in it as Zilla, and it's almost engendered female laying eggs, where before in the Japanese films it was always referred to as it, sort of gender neutral. The American cut of Gojira, Godzilla King of the Monsters, sort of engendered him as male, but it's a real departure, at least in look and feel, and the CG effects and everything that most Godzilla fans were used to.
I mean, another thing I want to think about is just the general image that we have of the Godzilla, as you know, as we refer to it as, because I mean, we've had the original 1954, but I mean, what came overseas was the 55 American re-edit, and then we got the 98 disaster, as we want to call it, and just the general idea of that we've had on over here in the West of Godzilla is it's just a big dinosaur, and you know, it's not a lot of plot. It's just, oh, you want to see this movie, you want to see a big monster destroy a city or two, and that's all it is. And one thing that I'm really excited for more than anything about this new movie that's coming out is we're going to go back to the roots of the 1954 version, where it's more political talk, it's more plot driven than it is about just, I just want to go see a monster go destroy a city. It's going to be a lot more behind it that's going to drive that plot, and I think really going to take it home for this movie.
Well, I think we got to vouch at least a little bit for the Japanese films that followed, the Godzilla series, because it's much more than maybe many American moviegoers or casual monster movie fans would know. They know primarily the American cut of Godzilla King of the Monsters, the 1998 film, but there are so many other films produced by Toho, the company that has Godzilla canon going on, from Godzilla Raids Again to Godzilla vs. Mothra, Mechagodzilla, King Ghidorah, all the other Daikaiju, giant monsters. And these are often referred to as kaiju films, and kaiju in Japan means strange creature, but it's the American equivalent of monster movies. So Godzilla, and just to sort of briefly mention it, the role of Godzilla has changed multiple times over the course of these films. He started as a force of nature to becoming a villain, then later on almost becoming sort of the protector or a patron saint of Tokyo, in that he's protecting it from, he's the lesser of two evils, from larger kaiju monsters or daikaiju monsters like the space monster, Mechagodzilla, Rodan, Mothra, although she's a benign monster as well, but I digress.
I mean, there you have it. I mean, we've got a brand new movie, we've got a new soundtrack, I mean, all this hype going behind it, we've got a new plot, new cast. I mean, I'm thinking this is going to look pretty good.
I think as a whole, it promises to tie into the old one enough that I want to go see it, and not just as an action film starring some of my favorite people, you know. It's something that I'm willing to go see because I like the old Godzilla films.
Exactly. Fans both old and new, I think, are going to get a little bit of something to pull from this movie. Whether you've been watching it since the start, been growing up with the monster movies, or it's something you're brand new to, I think it's going to have a little bit of something for everyone.
And Bryan Cranston's in it, but we should let those Breaking Bad fans out there know he's not Walter White, and I don't think he's going to be cooking up any sort of molecular batch to stop Godzilla.
No.
He's a nuclear physicist, so we'll see what happens in this film.
All right, well, I think that's enough Godzilla talk for now. We're going to throw it to break, and we'll be right back afterwards.
Yeah, salad on Saturday, fruit on Friday, throw a ball Thursday, water Wednesday, touch your toes Tuesday, let's move Monday, swap us next Sunday.
60 minutes of physical activity a day and eating well can help get your child healthy. So keep them active and eating well every day. Get ideas, get involved, get going at letsmove.gov. That's letsmove.gov.
Hey folks, welcome back to Real Talk. We're here with a movie specialist here when it comes to all things monsters, Brandon McKinney, just wrapping up our discussion on Godzilla and monster movies in general. So, since you're the expert, I'll ask you, when it comes to monster movies, I mean, what really just sets the tone for monster pieces everywhere?
Well, I could speak at it more from a horror angle because that's sort of my area of expertise. There are no regulation bodies that make me necessarily an expert on it, but I've loved horror films since I was a kid, and that's sort of where I always gravitate to. And the horror genre itself, there are many ways to distinguish it from other genres. It's the fact that it deals with films that are exclusively based on terror, sort of extreme fear. But the main thing that separates horror films apart from other genres is the role of a monster, okay? Some sort of monster, and it's not just necessarily from a cursory sort of overall aspect, generic sort of level, surface level. It's more about what this monster, its role and what it represents. And I will go, I'll start back. I know you guys want to go in a couple different directions, but I will start with sort of the classic horror, the classic monster movies, which came out in the 1930s, that launched horror in the United States. Horror didn't necessarily exist as a term until Dracula and Frankenstein popped up, the Universal Classics, okay, with Bela Lugosi as the Count and Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's creature. And it's more about what these monsters represent and what they do. It's said that there are sort of 3 prototype monsters, at least in horror, and they are the Dracula, or the vampire, as a sexual predator. You've got the thing that has no name, which is Frankenstein's creature, sort of the man-made monster. And then you have the doppelganger, the other self, which is sort of embodied by Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Or you can look at it, the Wolfman, sort of that other self. So these films worked for the public. They sort of played upon repressed desires, fears. In the 1930s, that's mainly what these monsters sort of served as. There was a drop-off in the 40s, okay? Suddenly with the onset of World War II, the horrors, obviously, of the casualties of war, not counting the Holocaust and the discovery of some of the atrocities that were happening over in those concentration camps. Suddenly, Bela Lugosi with a cape, I want to suck your blood, wasn't so frightening anymore. No. So those monsters, classic monsters, since started died out in the 40s and film noir took over. But then in the 50s, after we saw, and Godzilla's a key component in this era, the sort of nuclear war and Red Scare paranoia of the 50s, the fear of technology, launched these a whole new generation of monsters. And at this point, we have the large, giant insects, the giant ants of them, and of course the pod people. A
lot of sci-fi B movies. You get Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which didn't come till later, but still all those kinds of things. A lot now suddenly your fear is based from people who come from space, the unknown, things that we don't understand, and that's where it's all coming in.
And again, these monsters, it's what they represent. Okay, it's not just a big bug. Isn't oh, it's scary. I don't like bugs. Now I got a big bug. Ooh. But it's more about what they represent for the audience and what they embody, at least from a horror angle, because that's kind of what I look for is why are these films scary? What's so frightening about them? Arguably, some of these are campy and they're funny, especially from going back, where we sit now in the new millennium, going back to the 50s and watching these. Man, they're cheesy. But, they're also a lot of fun. But at the time, they were great popcorn movies, great drive-in movies. And the 50s definitely were a decade for that. And they dealt sort of subconsciously with our fears of technology and our fears with a Cold War that could suddenly become very hot.
I remember when I was real young, my first real experience with all these monster movies was actually I had my grandfather had a ridiculously large collection of classic monster movies. I mean, he had all of the Godzilla series, he had that stuff, he had some of the newer, really campy, cheesy ones, and he really enjoyed them. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that, they was playing on fears and stuff like that. For me, I was just like, oh, cool, this guy's destroying stuff. So, of course, I'd set up my army men and, run through the living room, terrorizing everything. But I mean, it's now that I can see it from a different perspective. I mean, you're completely right. I mean, it's something that there are a lot of different monsters and a lot of different fears that they kind of represent. I mean, I guess my grandfather, when he first saw it, it was feelings about the Cold War, things like that. Towards the end, but back World War II, because he did serve in World War II. And for him, like that kind of stuff hit him real hard. And now I can go back from a historical standpoint and be like, wow, I could see the impact that these horror movies and monster movies had just in our historic culture, really, and like where film has come from, horror as a genre, as you were saying, because of them. So I mean, that's just kind of interesting to think about.
And you talk about the way that horror as a genre has changed, and we don't see the classic monsters so much anymore. Except for in B movies that are intentionally cheesy, they're intentionally bad, for lack of a better word. But the thing that you see in horror all the time now is sometimes it feels like cheap scares, jump scares, haunted house. But the common theme is possession now, which is that it's kind of the duality of self, like you were talking about with the doppelganger. And but we don't get it through the Wolfman anymore. We don't get it through Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. We get it a lot through I'm being possessed by something, so it's me, but it's not me. And it's kind of changed the face of horror a little bit to where you don't have these monsters. It's all fear of self, and it's self-doubt and that kind of thing.
Well, every genre has a cycle, okay, and the horror genre itself is no stranger or is not exempt from this. There are primitive films, and if we're looking at horror, the primitive films are sort of the early German silence, okay, the German expressionist films.
Rabbi's Golem and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
right. Nosferatu,
Yes.
Caligari,
Yes.
those great
Yes.
films. But and they have their monsters, of course. But it doesn't sort of typify what we think of as a classic monster movie until we get into the 30s. And I'm thinking of a classic sort of paradigm or narrative, very basic, that here is this other, and there's a big concept in horror of the other, something different, okay, comes up and upsets the established order, the status quo, only for it to be put down by the sort of now cliched mob of villagers with torches and pitchforks, okay? And most of the films of that era sort of fit into that cookie cutter image. Then we get into the 50s and they come back, and although it's different monsters and what they represent is a bit different, it's still that same classic format. Here comes this big giant insect, it disrupts order, and again, not necessarily villagers, but an army and scientists comes back to put it down. You mentioned about the possession films and kind of where we went into the 60s and into the 70s. There's a huge shift in the culture, okay, with Vietnam, the social revolution, sexual revolution, everything, civil rights going on. And horror had to sort of
Adapt.
And sort of play on these fears or deal with the problems that we had as a society psychologically. So we enter what is referred to as the revisionist phase of the horror genre, where there's a monster, but who really is the monster? And is the hero always going to win? Is society going to come back and put down the monster by the end? The films we see of the 60s into the 70s and now even beyond, what you're seeing as a result of it, we're technically still in a revisionist period. The values are not necessarily fixed and affirmed. So there's a lot of different directions we go, and it's difficult for us now to almost to trust the filmmaker. We don't know if the hero or the heroine is going to survive by the end of the story.
Unreliable narrators, all that kind of things, they end up coming out in that era of horror.
Yeah, I mean, now that you say that, I think about some of, like, I guess through my generation, some of my favorite horror films that really got me, or, thrillers in general, would be films that did play off that fact, is, who really is the bad guy here? I mean, my first movie that comes to mind was, and I won't blow anything for anybody who hasn't seen it, but Law Abiding Citizen. If you've never seen the movie, it's a psychological horror thriller of a sense where, you start at the beginning and you have one certain mindset, and as the film goes on, you do nothing but question. Like, you started rooting for the protagonist, but then you think, is he really the protagonist? And that was the first time that theme really stood out to me. And I guess thinking back on it, you're right. I mean, going through that whole era, you've got culture changes back in the 60s and 70s. Who is the bad guy here? I mean, you think about, we were talking earlier, the Godzilla films. He's went through a whole transition. At first, he was just an entity, and then went to being, Godzilla's revenge, and came back like it was this evil creature, and then it did a transition where now it's the protector. And I guess thinking back on it, the whole changing of sides is something you have to do to keep things up and active in Hollywood, but playing on those feelings of just questioning yourself. I mean, you can always create a monster or something that'll scare people, but the best way to do that is scare them from within, from your own feelings, your own emotions. Play off that, because as I was once told, the monster you can put on screen will never be as scary as the monster you can come up with in your head.
That's a very good way to look at it. And you're talking about the film that you mentioned where there's a sort of who is really the monster. The film that really draws the line in the sand for me, and the one that is often said to be the first modern horror film, is Psycho. Okay, Hitchcock, often said to be the greatest director ever, and of course he's often said to have the greatest horror film and the first horror film of the modern age. And again, we have Norman Bates, who's a monster. But halfway through the film, or early on, the first third, we're now identifying with Norman Bates as a frame of reference. So suddenly he's become our protagonist, but he's also the monster. So it's a very odd shift in that.
When we talk about, questioning who the monster is. You've got some tropes that come up in modern movies, and a lot of times, it's the psycho killer that lives on my street. It's the redneck killer that lives on my street. And that brings us to our DVD of the week, because here we are with Tucker and Dale versus Evil. It's one of my favorite movies, and it's a horror comedy of sorts, in which these two hillbillies, Tucker and Dale, are going up to their summer home, and they encounter a group of co-eds who are going up to go camping.
It's stereotypical college party.
It's a stereotypical horror movie, the whole lost in the woods, getting chased through the woods, but
it's very Shakespearean.
Right. It's a comedy of
and
errors.
this sounds odd, doesn't it?
It does. You're thinking, oh, hillbilly comedy horror Shakespeare? No, it's funny because they go up there and encounter the teens, and the teens are naturally afraid, and, oh, these creepy hillbillies, what are they doing here? They're going to kill us, guys. And
that's profiling.
That is profiling. That is
wrong.
Stereotyping, and nobody should do it.
It's not nice. Don't do it.
But through a comedy of errors, the first being one of the girls they're all going swimming in the lake, and she jumps in, hits her head, falls unconscious. The two hillbillies are out night fishing. They go to save her, and all her friends see is them dragging her body out of the lake. And thus ensues the hilarious twisting and turning plot where who's really the bad guy here?
I prefer to refer to them as outdoorsmen.
Outdoorsmen,
the term
not
hillbilly.
hillbillies.
I'm trying to be a little, nicer there. These
a little more kind.
They're outdoorsmen, and they they found what is supposedly their dream vacation home. This is
It's a
cabin,
rundown shack, but they are the happiest men alive to own this cabin. And then these kids start killing themselves around them. It's crazy. It's a comedy of errors. It's a great movie to see. I recommend it to anyone. The DVD's got some nice special features. They actually do a perspective kind of cut together of if this were a horror movie from the college kid's perspective. So you do get both sides of the story with this DVD. I'd recommend it to everyone. But Brandon, I think that's all the time we have.
Well, before we wrap it up, I'd like to invite everyone at home watching this now to reach under their chair and find the copy. This is an Oprah moment. Audrey's got a copy of Tucker and Dale versus Evil under your chair.
Right,
So I'm going to take mine.
No, but you can go ahead, and thank you for
excellent.
joining
Thank
us
you.
on
thanks
Real
a lot for
Talk so
joining
much,
us.
Brandon.
Thanks, guys. It's been fun.
Now that we are done discussing our horror movies and our monster movies, it's time for the Movie Minute.
All right. Wes Anderson's latest quirky creation, The Grand Budapest Hotel, is already breaking box office records in its limited release run. The film has grossed over $800,000 playing on just 4 screens in New York and LA.
Former SNL star Jason Sudeikis will be filling Chevy Chase's shoes in the upcoming reboot, Fletch 1. Director Michael Ritchie expects success as he's already planning a franchise if all things go well with the first movie.
DC's upcoming sequel to Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, recently pushed back its release date to 2016. However, recent reports say the construction has begun in a small town called Metamora, Michigan.
Speaking of Superman, Jesse Eisenberg is slated to play the big baddie Lex Luthor as a skinhead punk. Here's to hoping he shaves his luxurious mane before shooting begins.
Jessica Alba and Mickey Rourke will be returning to the big screen in Frank Miller and Robert Rodriguez's Sin City, A Dame to Kill For. The sequel will promises more noir violence.
Kavin Wallace and Jamie Foxx showcased their vocal power in the new Annie trailer. Set to release this December, the movie musical also stars Cameron Diaz as Miss Hannigan. I think we hit a minute.
That's all we got for you. So, thank folks. That's all we got for you. Thanks for joining us today on Real Talk. Once again, I'm Aaron Stolze.
And I'm Audrey Schroeder. Join us again next time.
Take it easy, folks.